This is the 1.6 gallon version of the American Standard Madera, a toilet that's been around since at least 1992 and made up until 2010. This toilet hasn't really aged the greatest, and there are pretty many aspects of why many people do not like these toilets. Is it the worst toilet ever made? No, there's far too many worse toilets than this, but we're going to talk about why this model has not aged the greatest. Beginning with the overall design, it's nothing to write home about. It's pretty simplistic. It has a 2-inch trapway, although around 2008 they increased to 2 1/8. And it's also front fed, as you can see from that jet right there. Trapway opening is definitely pretty interesting. As you can see, it's got a pretty interesting shape to it. The siphon jet is right there. And the bowl itself is pretty strangely designed, for better or for worse. As you can tell, the rim jets are angled, but do not be fooled by that. The bourance isn't the greatest on this. Not only that, you have a front part here that sometimes stuff can get stuck on if you're on weaker pressure, so again, kind of a weird design flaw there. Now let's take a look at a flush. The flush is pretty standard, although it is made for swirling if on normal to higher pressure, which is an interesting design until you realize that the bowl rinse is not great. In fact, it can be pretty crappy sometimes. This is strange because you figured the bowl rinse would be pretty reasonable enough, right? But it just isn't. The background often gets stains. Sometimes the front line gets stains. It's just weird, but we'll take a look at it one more time from this angle. It's pretty crap on this, especially considering the angled jets, but it just did. Not to add, if the quality control is down, you'll have a chance of getting no ports at all. So let's talk about one thing I do like about these. The performance is pretty strong for what it is. For something with 2 inches, I would expect it to clog a lot. I rarely see these clogged. Now, I've obviously seen a few clogged, but compared to something like a Kohler High Crest, this thing clogs less. Now, besides the bowl rinse, these things have been known for having pretty poor quality control. Now, in the 90s, nothing too bad. Although, when we get to the early to mid 2000s, it's when things start taking a dip in quality. Early 2000s, some things are known for shredding and having like rusted bowl rinse. And then you get to the mid 2000s, which is probably the worst era to buy one. They are known for constantly shredding and having little no bowl rinse. They kind of fixed this in the late 2000s before its discontinuation, but it was a little too late before that. While I did mention shredding, it isn't as common as you might think. Although it depends on what era you're using, because it's pretty inconsistent. Usually the 90s isn't common about shredding, although you may come across it sometimes. But the 2000s is when you'll have that timeline where you'll probably see a little bit more shred. That's because the quality control took a dip. It thankfully isn't as common, but you may come across it once in a while. And that is the 1.6 Madera. Not a lot to talk about, but this is a pretty mixed bag generation. Sometimes it's crappy, sometimes it's eh. It often depends on the year when you get it, and that's kind of a sucky thing to go off of, but to be fair, there's worse toilets out there, but this has not aged all the greatest. But now it's time to grade it. While the design of the 1.6 Madera isn't anything to write home about, it thankfully doesn't look that generic. I actually do like some of its design elements, even though there isn't really much to write home about it, though it does give it a score of a 5. The quality control of this toilet is its biggest weakness. During the 90s, the quality control wasn't that bad, but when the 2000s hit, especially the mid-2000s, the quality control just took a nosedive for the worst. This often leads to a lot of problems, especially during the mid-2000s era, where things like shredding is a little bit more common, as well as the little to no balance some of these will eventually get. It's not a great look. Overall, I'll have to rank the quality control a 3. The consistency of this toilet is weird to say the least. During the 90s, the standard height models would be a little bit more weirder looking, while the comfort height ones look more normal, but at the same time have varied water spots. But during the late 90s, this one will have its more known design. Though it does get weird around the early to mid 2000s with a lot more defective looking openings, and it didn't really get better towards the late 2000s either, when some of them were more known to have crooked traps around that time. It's weird, but it's slightly more consistent than what the 1.6 airflows would be, but by a very slim margin. I'd have to give it a 4. The trapway, though, is definitely one of its more stronger points. While the trapway isn't anything really to write home about, it's definitely sufficeable and actually works fairly well for what it is. It mostly has a 2-inch trapway until you talk about the late 2000s, in which it got a slight increase to 2 1/8, but it's fairly functional and I have to give it a 6. While the flush is a little bit more on the boring side, I do have to give credit for it being designed to swirl when it has the right amount of pressure, though, as I mentioned, it is pressure-based for the swirl. But it is nice that it is featured in it and at least gets a 5. The pull is sufficeable and gets the job done most of the time on these toilets. However, sometimes you might come across one that might shred. Thankfully, it isn't as common as something like the Kohler High Crest or the second generation Ultra Signature, or literally any other awful toilet you could probably think of, though it is something you might come across once in a while though, so do keep that in mind, and that's why the most I can give it is a 5. The performance is definitely one of its more stronger points, and something I do like about these toilets. Compared to something like a Kohler High Crest or even a 1.6 Airflow, I definitely noticed that these tend to be more stronger performers. Now, is it impossible to clog one? Not really. I've seen a few clogged here and there, but compared to something like the 1.6 Alpha or the High Crest, it clogs a lot less than both of those combined. Which is kind of surprising considering it only has a 2-inch trapway. But it does work surprisingly well, so I'll give it a 7. The best way to describe the barns on these is too good to be true. While it looks like the barns would be alright on these, thanks to the varying quality control of these toilets throughout the ages, it can range from something like a 5 to something like a 1. It's crazy to think about, especially considering that these were designed to swirl, which is supposed to help the barns, right? Well, unfortunately, it does not. Due to the varying degrees of barns quality, I'd have to give this at most a 3. It's pretty crappy, unfortunately. And it sucks to see, too. Though these technically have a stronger performance compared to most toilets from the time, the staying power might be a little bit affected due to the poor quality control on these toilets. It often depends on what area you get this toilet in, but some may outlast others. So I'd have to give it a 6 at most for survivability. The value of these toilets can be best described as a mixed bag. Some makes of this toilet might be fine, others might be complete crap. And unfortunately, that's just the thing with these toilets. This also applies to the 1.6 Airflows, though I'll go more in depth in that in a later video. But at the end of the day, these are far from the worst toilets, but the quality control do make these a bit varied in terms of being good or bad, which is not something you want to be based on. It's still better than some toilets from the time, but the varying quality might be a turnoff for some people. This toilet at the end of the day can be described as a mixed bag. And it's definitely not a great thing to be called that, considering that you want some consistency, but unfortunately this model doesn't really offer it. I'd have to give the value a 4. And the final score of the 1.6 American Standard Madera from the 1990s to the 2000s is a 48 out of 100. While it's not the worst toilet ever made, the quality control definitely does bring these toilets down a little bit. Sometimes the quality is fine, other times it is pretty crap. I really do not like the inconsistent quality control of these toilets. This often affects things like boards and even sometimes the pull and flush. Though at the end of the day, this toilet does have some strong points compared to other toilets from the same timeline. Though at the end of the day, this toilet definitely deserved better in quality control. But they turned out to be a mixed bag.